The room was cold, sterile, and filled with a faint hum of machinery. Bright lights flickered above, casting sharp shadows on the walls. The air smelled strange, metallic, yet sweet, like nothing he had ever encountered before. His head throbbed, and his body felt heavy, as if he had been lying there for days. Or weeks. He couldn't tell. He blinked, trying to clear his vision. Figures moved around him, tall and slender, their skin a pale shade of blue. They spoke in low, guttural tones, their words unfamiliar but urgent. One of them noticed he was awake and let out a sharp, startled cry. The others turned, their large, black eyes widening in disbelief. "He's alive," one of them said, the words translated by a small device on its chest. "Impossible." The human tried to sit up, but his muscles refused to obey. His throat was dry, and his voice came out as a rasp. "Where am I?" The aliens exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of fear and fascination. One of them stepped forward, its long fingers trembling as it reached out to touch his arm. "You were exposed to the poison," it said slowly, as if struggling to believe its own words. "The same poison that killed every other species it touched. And yet, you survived." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The human frowned, trying to piece together what had happened. His memories were fragmented, like shards of glass scattered across his mind. He remembered a crash, a planet with a red sky, and something else. Something he couldn't quite grasp. "What poison?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The alien hesitated, then gestured to a screen on the wall. The image that appeared made his blood run cold. It was a recording of a laboratory, filled with rows of cages. Inside each cage was a creature, some small and insect-like, others large and reptilian. All of them were dead, their bodies twisted and contorted in agony. "This is what the poison does," the alien said, its voice trembling. "It attacks the nervous system, shutting down the body within hours. We've tested it on dozens of species. None have survived. Until you." The human stared at the screen, a chill running down his spine. He didn't understand how he had survived. He didn't even know what the poison was. But one thing was clear, he was different. And that difference had saved his life. The aliens began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising in excitement. "We must study him," one of them said. "If we can understand how he survived, we might be able to create a cure. Or even a weapon." The human's heart sank. He had seen enough sci-fi movies to know where this was going. He wasn't a person to them. He was an experiment. A specimen. And if he wasn't careful, he might never leave this place alive. But for now, he was alive. And that was enough. The human closed his eyes, trying to block out the sterile, alien surroundings. His mind drifted back to the beginning, to the mission that had brought him here. The inside was like a maze, with corridors that twisted and turned in every direction. The air was stale, and the walls were lined with more of the strange symbols. It felt like walking through a tomb. Then they found it. In the center of the structure was a chamber, circular and domed, with a pedestal in the middle. On the pedestal was an object, small and unassuming, but radiating an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was a crystal, clear and smooth, with a faint glow that pulsed in time with the signal they had picked up. The team had gathered around it, their voices hushed. No one knew what it was, but they all felt it, something powerful, something ancient. The captain had given the order to take it back to the ship for further study. That was when everything went wrong. As soon as the crystal was removed from the pedestal, the ground began to shake. The walls of the chamber cracked, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The team had scrambled to get out, but the corridors were collapsing around them. He remembered running, his heart pounding in his chest, the crystal clutched tightly in his hands. They had made it back to the ship, but just barely. The structure had collapsed behind them, burying whatever secrets it had held. The captain had ordered an immediate takeoff, and they had left the planet behind, the crystals safely stored in the ship's lab. For a while, everything seemed fine. The crew had celebrated their discovery, joking about how they would be famous when they returned home. But then, one by one, they started to get sick. It started with headaches, then fever, then pain, sharp and unrelenting, like nothing any of them had ever felt before. The ship's doctor had tried everything, but nothing worked. Within hours, the first crew member died. Then the second. Then the third. He had been the last one left. He didn't know how he had survived. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was something in his DNA. All he knew was that he had woken up in the alien facility, surrounded by beings who looked at him like he was a miracle. But he didn't feel like a miracle. He felt like a prisoner. The alien facility was a maze of corridors and chambers, each one more sterile and lifeless than the last. The walls were made of a smooth, metallic material that reflected the harsh, artificial light. The air was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of something chemical, like disinfectant. It was a place designed for function, not comfort. The human was kept in a small room, barely large enough to fit the cot he slept on and the table where they brought his meals. The door was always locked, and the only window was a narrow slit high up on the wall, too small to see through. He had no idea what lay beyond the facility, but he could guess. The planet was harsh, unforgiving, and nothing like Earth. The aliens who studied him were a strange mix of curiosity and fear. They were tall and slender, with long limbs and delicate fingers. Their skin was a pale blue, almost translucent, and their eyes were large and black, like pools of ink. They spoke in low, guttural tones, their words translated by small devices they wore on their chests. They called themselves the Velani, though he didn't know if that was their species name or just the name of their group. At first, they had treated him with a kind of distant respect. They brought him food and water, checked his vitals, and asked him questions about his home world. But as the days passed, their curiosity turned into something darker. They began to see him not as a person, but as a puzzle to be solved. A mystery to be unraveled. The leader of the group was a Velani named Kaeldar. He was taller than the others, with a commanding presence that made it clear he was in charge. His voice was deep and resonant, and his eyes seemed to pierce through the human whenever he spoke. Kaeldar was the one who had ordered the experiments, the one who saw the human as nothing more than a test subject. "You are unique," Kaeldar had said during one of their early conversations. "Your survival defies all logic. We must understand why." The human had tried to explain that he didn't know why he had survived, but Kaeldar wasn't interested in excuses. He wanted answers, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get them. The experiments began soon after. They took samples of his blood, his skin, even his hair. They scanned his body with machines that hummed and clicked, their lights flashing in patterns he couldn't understand. They exposed him to small doses of the poison, watching closely as his body fought it off. Each test left him weaker, more exhausted, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Not all the Velani agreed with Kaeldar's methods. One of them, a scientist named Lyra N., seemed to genuinely care about his well-being. She was smaller than the others, with a softer voice and a gentler demeanor. She often stayed behind after the tests, checking on him and making sure he was comfortable. "I don't agree with what they're doing to you," she had confessed one day, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Kaeldar is in charge. There's nothing I can do." The human had nodded, too tired to argue. He didn't trust her, not completely, but he appreciated the small kindnesses she showed him. It was a reminder that not all the Velani saw him as an experiment. As the days turned into weeks, the human began to learn more about the Velani and their world. The planet they called home was a harsh, unforgiving place. The surface was covered in jagged mountains and deep, winding canyons. The atmosphere was thin, and the air was filled with dust and ash from constant volcanic activity. It was a world that demanded resilience, and the Velani had adapted to survive. Their technology was advanced, far beyond anything humans had ever created. They had machines that could heal wounds in minutes, devices that could manipulate gravity, and weapons that could vaporize solid rock. But for all their advancements, they were still vulnerable. The poison had shown them that. The human had overheard conversations between the scientists, snippets of information that painted a grim picture. The poison wasn't just a threat to the Velani, it was a threat to every species they had encountered. It spread quickly, infecting entire populations before anyone realized what was happening. The Velani had tried to contain it, but their efforts had failed. The poison was too powerful, too unpredictable. And now, they believed the human held the key to stopping it. The tension in the facility grew with each passing day. Kaeldar became more impatient, more demanding. He pushed the human harder, exposing him to larger doses of the poison and running more invasive tests. The other scientists followed his orders, but their unease was palpable. They knew they were walking a fine line, balancing their desire for answers with their fear of what might happen if they pushed too far. The human, for his part, tried to stay strong. He focused on the small victories, the moments of rest between tests, the occasional kindness from Lyra N, the memories of Earth that kept him grounded. But he knew it was only a matter of time before something broke. And then, one day, it did. During one of the tests, the poison mutated. It became more aggressive, more deadly. The machines monitoring the human's vitals began to blare alarms, their lights flashing red. The scientists scrambled to contain the situation, but it was too late. The poison had spread to one of the Velani. The infected alien collapsed, its body convulsing as the poison took hold. The others watched in horror, unable to do anything as their comrade died in front of them. It was a grim reminder of what they were dealing with, and what was at stake. Kaeldar's reaction was immediate. He ordered the human to be isolated, his tests put on hold until they could figure out what had gone wrong. But the damage had already been done. The Velani were divided, their fear and desperation driving a wedge between them. The human knew things were about to get worse. And he had no idea how he was going to survive it. The facility was in chaos. The death of the infected Velani had sent shockwaves through the team, and the atmosphere was tense. The scientists moved quickly, their voices sharp with urgency as they worked to contain the mutated poison. The human was isolated in his room, his tests temporarily suspended, but he could feel the weight of their fear and desperation pressing down on him. Lyra N was the only one who still visited him regularly. She brought him food and water, checked his vitals, and made sure he was comfortable. But there was a new urgency in her movements, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "We need to figure out what's happening," she said one day, her voice low and urgent. "The poison is changing. It's becoming more aggressive. If we don't find a way to stop it, it could wipe out entire species." The human nodded, his mind racing. He had seen what the poison could do, and he knew how dangerous it was. But he also knew that the Velani's methods weren't working. They were too focused on studying him, on trying to replicate his biology, and not enough on understanding the poison itself. "What do you know about the poison?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Lyra N hesitated, then sat down on the edge of his cot. "We thought it was a chemical," she said slowly. "A toxin that attacked the nervous system. But now, we're not so sure. The way it mutates, the way it spreads, it's almost like it's alive." The words sent a chill down his spine. "Alive?" She nodded, her expression grim. "We've been studying it under the microscope, and we found something strange. It's not just a chemical. It's an organism. A microscopic parasite that infects its host and takes over their body." That's why it's so deadly. It's not just poisoning its victims, it's controlling them. The human stared at her, his mind reeling. A parasite. That changed everything. If the poison was alive, then it could adapt, evolve, and become even more dangerous. And if it could control its hosts. That's why I survived, he said slowly, the pieces falling into place. My body fought it off. My immune system recognized it as a threat and destroyed it. Lyra nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. Exactly. Your biology is unique. Your immune system is stronger, more adaptable than any species we've encountered. If we can understand how it works, we might be able to create a cure. Or even a vaccine. The human frowned, his thoughts racing. It made sense, but it also raised more questions. Why was his immune system so different? Was it something unique to humans, or was it just luck? And even if they could replicate his biology, would it be enough to stop the poison? There's something else, Lyra said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Kaeldar, he's not just interested in finding a cure. He wants to weaponize the poison. He thinks if we can control it, we can use it against our enemies. The human's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. Kaeldar wasn't just trying to save his people, he was trying to gain power. And that made him even more dangerous. You can't let him do that, the human said, his voice firm. If this poison gets out, it could destroy entire civilizations. You've seen what it can do. Lyra nodded, her expression grim. I know. But Kaeldar is in charge. And he's not the only one who thinks this way. Many of the others, they're scared. They see the poison as a threat, but also as an opportunity. They think if they can control it, they'll be unstoppable. The human leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit back and let the Vaylani turn the poison into a weapon. But what could he do? He was a prisoner, isolated and powerless. He needed an ally. He looked at Lyra, studying her face. She seemed sincere, but could he trust her? She had shown him kindness, but she was still one of them. Still a Vaylani. Will you help me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. I don't agree with what Kaeldar is doing. But I can't stop him alone. If we work together, maybe we can find a way to destroy the poison before it's too late. The human nodded, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Together, they might be able to find a way to stop the poison and prevent Kaeldar from turning it into a weapon. But time was running out. The next few days were a blur of activity. Lyra brought him data from the experiments, sharing everything she knew about the poison. They worked together, analyzing the information and trying to find a weakness. The human's knowledge of biology was limited, but he had a knack for seeing patterns, for connecting the dots in ways the Vaylani couldn't. They discovered that the poison thrived in certain conditions, high temperatures, low oxygen levels, and specific chemical compounds. It was also highly adaptable, able to mutate rapidly in response to new threats. But it had one weakness: it couldn't survive in extreme cold. If we can lower the temperature enough, we might be able to kill it, Lyra said, her voice filled with hope. The human nodded, but he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The poison was already spreading, and they didn't have the resources to create a large-scale cooling system. They needed another plan. Then, one night, the human had an idea. What if we use my blood? He asked, his voice filled with excitement. If my immune system can fight off the poison, maybe we can use it to create a cure. Lyra's eyes widened. It's risky, she said slowly. But it might work. We'd need to extract a sample and synthesize it, but if we can replicate your immune response. The human nodded, his heart pounding. It was a long shot, but it was their best chance. And if it worked, they might be able to stop the poison before it was too late. But they would have to act quickly. Kaeldar was growing more impatient, more desperate. He was pushing the experiments harder, exposing the human to larger doses of the poison and running more invasive tests. The human could feel his body weakening, his strength fading with each passing day. And then, one night, everything changed. The alarms blared, their shrill sound echoing through the facility. The human sat up, his heart racing as the door to his room slid open. Lyra stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "It's Kaeldar," she said, her voice trembling. "He's gone too far. He's exposed himself to the poison." The human's blood ran cold. "What? Why?" Lyra shook her head, her expression filled with despair. "He thinks he can control it. He thinks he can become something more. But he's wrong. The poison, it's too powerful. It's already taking over." The human stood, his mind racing. If Kaeldar was infected, then the entire facility was in danger. The poison could spread quickly, infecting everyone in its path. They had to stop it. Now. "Take me to him," he said, his voice firm. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. Together, they ran through the corridors, the alarms blaring around them. The facility was in chaos, the Velani scrambling to contain the outbreak. But it was too late. The poison was already spreading. And the human knew that if they didn't act fast, it would be the end of them all. The facility was in chaos. The alarms blared relentlessly, their shrill sound echoing through the corridors. Velani scientists scrambled in every direction, their voices filled with panic as they tried to contain the outbreak. The poison was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, and Kaeldar's reckless experiment had only made things worse. The human and Lyra moved quickly, weaving through the chaos as they made their way to the central lab. The air was thick with tension, and the human could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. If they didn't act fast, the poison would consume everything, and everyone, in its path. "We need to get to the lab," Lyra said, her voice urgent. "If we can synthesize a cure from your blood, we might be able to stop this." The human nodded, his mind racing. He knew it was a long shot, but it was their only hope. His body had fought off the poison once before, and if they could replicate that resistance, they might be able to save the facility, and maybe even the Velani. But first, they had to get past Kaeldar. The central lab was sealed off, its heavy doors locked tight. Kaeldar had barricaded himself inside, determined to see his experiment through to the end. The human could see him through the observation window, his tall figure hunched over a console as he worked feverishly. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his movements were jerky and uncoordinated. The poison was already taking hold. "He's infected," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with dread. "We have to stop him before it's too late." The human nodded, his jaw tightening. He didn't know if Kaeldar could be reasoned with, but they had to try. He stepped forward, pounding on the door with his fist. "Kaeldar," he shouted, his voice echoing through the corridor. "Open the door. You're putting everyone in danger." For a moment, there was no response. Then Kaeldar turned, his black eyes locking onto the humans. There was something different about him, something wrong. His expression was twisted, his features contorted with a mixture of pain and rage. The poison was changing him, turning him into something else. "You," Kaeldar snarled, his voice distorted and guttural. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing but a test subject. A tool." The human shook his head, his heart pounding. "This isn't you, Kaeldar. The poison is controlling you. You have to fight it." Kaeldar laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent chills down the human's spine. "Fight it? I don't want to fight it. I want to embrace it. The poison, it's power. Pure, unrelenting power. And soon, it will be mine. The human exchanged a glance with Lyra N, his mind racing. Kaeldar was too far gone. They couldn't reason with him. They had to find another way in. We need to override the door controls, Lyra N said, her voice low and urgent. There's a maintenance panel in the next room. If we can access it, we might be able to get inside. The human nodded, and they moved quickly, slipping into the adjacent room. The maintenance panel was hidden behind a wall of machinery, but Lyra N knew exactly where to look. She pulled out a small device and began working on the controls, her fingers flying over the keys. It's going to take a few minutes, she said, her voice tense. We need to buy some time. The human nodded, his mind racing. He didn't know how much time they had, but he knew they couldn't afford to waste it. He turned back to the observation window, his eyes locking onto Kaeldar's. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice firm. The poison isn't power. It's destruction. It's death. And if you let it spread, it will destroy everything, including you. Kaeldar sneered, his expression filled with contempt. You think you understand? You're nothing but a primitive creature from a backwater planet. You have no idea what true power is. The human clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. Maybe I don't. But I do know one thing, my body fought off the poison. And if you're so powerful, why couldn't you do the same? For a moment, Kaeldar hesitated. His expression faltered, and the human could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then the poison took hold again, and his face twisted into a snarl. Enough, he roared, slamming his fist against the console. I don't need your pathetic resistance. I will become something greater. Something unstoppable. The human shook his head, his heart sinking. There was no reaching Kaeldar now. The poison had consumed him completely. Got it. Lyra N said, her voice filled with relief. The door to the lab slid open with a hiss, and they rushed inside. Kaeldar turned, his eyes blazing with fury. You dare defy me, he snarled, his voice filled with rage. I will destroy you both. The human stepped forward, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he couldn't let Kaeldar win. He had to protect Lyra N. He had to protect everyone. Lyra N, get to the console, he said, his voice firm. I'll hold him off. Lyra N hesitated, then nodded. She darted past Kaeldar, her fingers flying over the controls as she worked to synthesize the cure. Kaeldar lunged at the human, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The human dodged, his instincts kicking in as he fought to keep Kaeldar at bay. The poison had made him stronger, but it had also made him slower, more predictable. The human used that to his advantage, dodging and weaving as he tried to buy time. You can't win, Kaeldar snarled, his voice filled with rage. The poison is unstoppable. It will consume everything. The human shook his head, his jaw tightening. Not if we stop it first. Lyra N's voice cut through the chaos. I've got it, she shouted, holding up a small vial filled with a clear liquid. The cure. The human's heart leaped, but there was no time to celebrate. Kaeldar roared, his rage boiling over as he lunged at Lyra N. The human moved quickly, intercepting him and tackling him to the ground. Do it, he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Lyra N hesitated for only a moment, then injected the cure into Kaeldar's arm. He screamed, his body convulsing as the cure fought against the poison. The human held him down, his heart pounding as he watched the struggle play out. For a moment, it seemed like the poison would win. But then, slowly, Kaeldar's body began to relax. His breathing slowed, and his eyes cleared. The poison was gone. The human let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body sagging with relief. They had done it. They had stopped the poison. But the fight wasn't over yet. The lab was eerily quiet after Kael'thar's collapse. The alarm still blared in the distance, but the immediate danger had passed, for now. The human sat on the floor, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His body ached from the struggle, but his mind was racing. They had stopped Kael'thar, but the poison was still out there, spreading through the facility. Lyra knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked the vial of cure. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with relief. "The cure works. But we need to act fast. The poison is still spreading, and if we don't stop it soon." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The human knew what was at stake. The poison had already claimed one life, and if they didn't act quickly, it would claim many more. "How much of the cure do we have?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lyra shook her head, her expression grim. "Not enough. This is just a prototype. We'll need to synthesize more, but it's going to take time. And we don't have much of that left." The human nodded, his mind racing. They needed a plan, a way to buy time while Lyra worked on producing more of the cure. But with the facility in chaos and the poison spreading, it wouldn't be easy. "We need to contain the outbreak," he said, his voice firm. "If we can isolate the infected areas, we might be able to slow it down." Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "There's a quarantine protocol. It's designed to seal off sections of the facility in case of a biological threat. If we can activate it, we might be able to buy some time." The human stood, his legs still shaky but determined. "Then let's do it. You work on the cure. I'll handle the quarantine." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you sure? The facility is huge, and the poison is dangerous. If you get infected..." The human shook his head, cutting her off. "I'll be careful. But we don't have a choice. If we don't stop this now, it's going to kill everyone." Lyra hesitated, then nodded. She handed him a small device, a portable scanner that could detect the poison. "Take this. It will alert you if you're near an infected area. And be careful. The poison is unpredictable." The human took the scanner, his jaw tightening. "I will. Just, hurry." With that, he turned and left the lab, his heart pounding as he stepped into the chaos of the facility. The corridors were a nightmare. The alarms blared relentlessly, their shrill sound echoing off the walls. Velani scientists ran in every direction, their faces filled with panic. Some were infected, their movements jerky and uncoordinated as the poison took hold. Others were trying to help, but it was clear they were overwhelmed. The human moved quickly, his scanner in hand as he made his way to the control room. The quarantine protocol could only be activated from there, but it was on the other side of the facility, a long, dangerous journey through infected areas. He didn't get far before the scanner beeped, its screen flashing red. He froze, his eyes scanning the corridor ahead. The air was thick with a strange, metallic smell, and the walls were covered in a faint, glowing residue. The poison. He took a step back, his heart racing. The scanner indicated that the poison was concentrated in the next room, but he had no way of knowing how far it had spread. He needed to find another route. Turning down a side corridor, he moved quickly, his senses on high alert. The facility was a maze, and every turn brought new dangers. He passed rooms filled with infected Velani, their bodies twisted and contorted as the poison consumed them. He wanted to help them, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the control room. The door was sealed, but the scanner indicated that the area was clear. He entered quickly, his eyes scanning the room for the controls. The control panel was a complex array of buttons and screens, but the human had spent enough time around Velani technology to figure it out. He activated the quarantine protocol, his fingers flying over the controls as he sealed off the infected sections of the facility. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud hiss, the doors to the infected areas slammed shut, their heavy locks engaging. The alarms stopped, and the facility fell into an eerie silence. The human let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body sagging with relief. They had bought some time. But the fight wasn't over yet. Back in the lab, Lyra N was working frantically to synthesize more of the cure. The human's blood was the key, but extracting and processing it was a delicate, time-consuming process. She had already produced several vials, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. The human entered the lab, his face pale and his clothes stained with sweat. "The quarantine is in place," he said, his voice hoarse. "But it's only a temporary solution. We need to distribute the cure before the poison finds a way to spread." Lyra N nodded, her hands trembling as she handed him a vial. "Take this. It's enough for 1 dose. We need to get it to the most critical cases first." The human took the vial, his jaw tightening. "What about you?" Lyra N shook her head. "I need to stay here and keep working. The more cure we have, the better our chances. But you need to go. You're the only one who can move through the facility without fear of infection." The human hesitated, then nodded. He didn't like the idea of leaving her alone, but he knew she was right. They didn't have a choice. "Be careful," he said, his voice filled with concern. Lyra N smiled faintly. "You too." With that, the human turned and left the lab, his heart pounding as he prepared to face the dangers ahead. The first dose went to a young Vaylani scientist who had been infected while trying to help others. The human found her in a sealed room, her body convulsing as the poison took hold. He injected the cure quickly, his hands trembling as he watched the struggle play out. For a moment, it seemed like the poison would win. But then, slowly, her body began to relax. Her breathing slowed, and her eyes cleared. The cure had worked. The human let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body sagging with relief. But there was no time to celebrate. He had more doses to deliver, and the clock was ticking. As he moved through the facility, he encountered more infected Vaylani, some on the brink of death, others still fighting the poison. He did what he could, administering the cure and offering words of encouragement. But with each dose he gave, he knew they were running out of time. Back in the lab, Lyra N worked tirelessly, her hands moving quickly as she synthesized more of the cure. But the process was slow, and the demand was overwhelming. She knew they couldn't save everyone, but she refused to give up. The human returned to the lab several times, his face pale and his body trembling with exhaustion. Each time, Lyra N handed him more vials, her eyes filled with determination. "We're making a difference," she said, her voice filled with hope. "But we need to keep going. We can't stop now." The human nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right. They had come too far to give up. But as he stepped back into the chaos of the facility, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The human's body was screaming for rest. Every muscle ached, every step felt like a battle, and his vision blurred with exhaustion. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. The facility was still in chaos, and the poison was spreading faster than they could contain it. He had already administered dozens of doses of the cure, but it wasn't enough. They needed more time, and more of the cure. Lyra N was working tirelessly in the lab, her hands moving quickly as she synthesized more of the life-saving serum. But even she was reaching her limits. The human could see it in her eyes, the strain, the fear, the desperation. They were both running on fumes, but they couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The human returned to the lab, his steps heavy and his breathing ragged. Lyra N looked up as he entered, her face pale and her eyes filled with worry. "You need to rest," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're pushing yourself too hard. If you collapse, we're all lost." The human shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I can't. There are still too many people out there who need help. If I stop now..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Lyra knew what was at stake. They both did. She handed him another vial of the cure, her fingers brushing against his for a brief moment. "Be careful," she said, her voice filled with concern. "And come back to me. We're in this together." The human nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He didn't know what he would do without her. She had been his anchor in this storm, his source of strength when he felt like giving up. And he knew he couldn't let her down. The next dose went to an elderly Velani scientist who had been infected while trying to protect his colleagues. The human found him in a sealed room, his body trembling as the poison took hold. He injected the cure quickly, his hands steady despite his exhaustion. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the scientist's breathing began to even out. His eyes cleared, and he looked up at the human with a mixture of gratitude and awe. You saved me," he whispered, his voice weak but filled with emotion. "Thank you." The human nodded, his throat tight. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're going to stop this. I promise." But as he left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in his chest. They were running out of time. The poison was spreading faster than they could contain it, and the cure was running low. They needed a miracle. Back in the lab, Lyra was working frantically to synthesize more of the cure. But the process was slow, and the demand was overwhelming. She knew they couldn't save everyone, but she refused to give up. She couldn't. The human entered the lab, his face pale and his body trembling with exhaustion. He collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands as he tried to catch his breath. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice filled with despair. "The poison is spreading too fast. We need to do something." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. "I know. But we're doing everything we can. We just need to keep going." The human looked up at her, his eyes filled with determination. "There's another way. My blood, it's the key. If we can use it to create a stronger cure, we might be able to stop the poison for good." Lyra hesitated, her eyes widening. "What are you saying?" The human took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I'm saying we need to take a risk. If we can extract more of my blood, we might be able to create a cure that's powerful enough to stop the poison. But it's dangerous. If we take too much..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Lyra knew what he was suggesting. And she didn't like it. "No," she said, her voice firm. "It's too risky. If we take too much of your blood, you could die. And we can't afford to lose you." The human shook his head, his jaw tightening. "We don't have a choice. If we don't do something now, we're all going to die. And I'd rather die trying to save everyone than sit back and do nothing." Lyra stared at him, her eyes filled with conflict. She wanted to argue, to tell him there had to be another way. But deep down, she knew he was right. They were out of options. "Okay," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But we do this together. And we're careful. No unnecessary risks." The human nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He knew this was a gamble, but it was one he was willing to take. For her. For everyone. The process was painful. Lyra extracted more of the human's blood, her hands trembling as she worked. The human gritted his teeth, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. But he didn't complain. He knew this was their only chance. As Lyra worked to synthesize the stronger cure, the human felt his strength fading. His vision blurred, and his body grew weaker with each passing moment. But he refused to give up. He couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lyra N held up a vial of the new cure. It was darker than the previous version, its color a deep, rich red. She looked at the human, her eyes filled with hope. "It's ready," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But we need to test it. And if it works?" The human nodded, his heart pounding. "Do it." Lyra N hesitated, then injected the new cure into a small sample of the poison. They watched in silence as the two substances mixed, their hearts pounding with anticipation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the poison began to dissolve. The cure was working. Lyra N let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her eyes filled with relief. "It works," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It actually works." The human smiled faintly, his body sagging with relief. But he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. They still had to distribute the cure, and fast. As Lyra N worked to produce more of the stronger cure, the human felt his strength fading. His vision blurred, and his body grew weaker with each passing moment. But he refused to give up. He couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lyra N handed him a vial of the new cure. "Take this," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "And be careful. We're so close." The human nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He took the vial, his hands trembling as he prepared to face the dangers ahead. But as he stepped into the corridor, he felt his legs give out. He collapsed to the floor, his vision fading as darkness closed in around him. The last thing he heard was Lyra N's voice, filled with panic. "No. Stay with me. Please." And then, everything went black. The human's body lay still on the cold floor of the lab, his breathing shallow and his skin pale. Lyra N knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked his vitals. His pulse was weak, and his temperature was dangerously low. The strain of the mission, and the blood loss, had pushed him to the brink. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice filled with panic. "You can't leave me. Not now. Not after everything." She worked quickly, her hands moving with a precision born of desperation. She hooked him up to a machine that would stabilize his condition, her heart pounding as she watched the numbers on the screen. They were too low. He was fading fast. But she couldn't let him go. Not after everything they had been through. Not after everything he had done for her, for all of them. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. The stronger cure had worked on the poison, but it wasn't enough. They needed something more, something that could not only stop the poison but also save the human. And she had an idea. A risky, dangerous idea. She turned to the console, her fingers flying over the controls as she pulled up the data from the human's blood samples. His immune system was unique, more adaptable than anything she had ever seen. If she could harness that adaptability, if she could create a cure that not only fought the poison but also boosted his body's natural defenses. It was a long shot. A dangerous, potentially deadly long shot. But it was their only chance. She worked quickly, her hands trembling as she synthesized the new cure. It was a combination of the human's blood and a powerful stimulant designed to kickstart his immune system. If it worked, it could save him. If it didn't. She didn't want to think about that. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she held up a vial of the new cure. It was darker than the previous versions, its color a deep, rich red. She looked at the human, her heart pounding with fear and hope. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "Please, let this work." She injected the cure into his arm, her hands trembling as she watched the monitor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the numbers began to change. His pulse grew stronger, his breathing steadied, and his temperature began to rise. Lyra N let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her eyes filled with relief. "It's working," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's actually working." But she knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The human was still weak, and the poison was still out there, spreading through the facility. They needed to act fast. The human's eyes fluttered open, his vision blurry as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. His body felt heavy, his mind foggy, but he could feel a strange warmth spreading through his veins. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto Lyra N's. What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lyra N smiled faintly, her eyes filled with relief. "You collapsed," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you're going to be okay. The new cure, it's working." The human nodded, his mind racing. He could feel the strength returning to his body, the fog lifting from his mind. But he knew they weren't done yet. "The poison," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to stop it." Lyra N nodded, her expression grim. "I know. But we need to be careful. You're still weak, and the poison is more dangerous than ever." The human shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I can't just sit here. There are still people out there who need help. And we're so close." Lyra N hesitated, then nodded. She handed him a vial of the new cure, her eyes filled with determination. "Take this. And be careful. We're in this together." The human nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He took the vial, his hands steadied despite his exhaustion. He knew this was their last chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. The facility was eerily quiet as the human moved through the corridors, his senses on high alert. The quarantine had slowed the spread of the poison, but it was still out there, lurking in the shadows. He could feel it, a strange, oppressive energy that made his skin crawl. He found the first infected Vellani in a sealed room, their body trembling as the poison took hold. He injected the new cure quickly, his heart pounding as he watched the struggle play out. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the Vellani's body began to relax. Their breathing steadied, and their eyes cleared. The cure had worked. The human let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body sagging with relief. But there was no time to celebrate. He had more doses to deliver, and the clock was ticking. As he moved through the facility, he encountered more infected Vellani, some on the brink of death, others still fighting the poison. He did what he could, administering the cure and offering words of encouragement. But with each dose he gave, he knew they were running out of time. Back in the lab, Lyra N worked tirelessly to produce more of the new cure. But the process was slow, and the demand was overwhelming. She knew they couldn't save everyone, but she refused to give up. She couldn't. The human returned to the lab several times, his face pale and his body trembling with exhaustion. Each time, Lyra N handed him more vials, her eyes filled with determination. "We're making a difference," she said, her voice filled with hope. "But we need to keep going. We can't stop now." The human nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right. They had come too far to give up. But as he stepped back into the chaos of the facility, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the human returned to the lab, his body trembling with exhaustion. He collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands as he tried to catch his breath. "It's done," he said, his voice filled with relief. "The poison, it's gone." Lyra N nodded, her eyes filled with emotion. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "We actually did it." The human looked up at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you." Lyra N smiled faintly, her eyes filled with relief. "We're in this together," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And we're not done yet." The human nodded, his heart pounding with hope. They had stopped the poison, but the fight wasn't over yet. They still had to rebuild, to heal, to move forward. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The facility was quiet now, the alarms silenced and the chaos replaced by an eerie calm. The poison was gone, defeated by the combined efforts of the human and Lyra N. But the scars of the crisis remained, both physical and emotional. The halls were empty, the once bustling labs now silent. The Velani who had survived were recovering, their bodies weak but their spirits unbroken. The human sat in the lab, his body still trembling with exhaustion. His wounds had been treated, and the new cure had restored his strength, but the toll of the mission weighed heavily on him. He had faced death, not just for himself but for everyone in the facility. And now, as the adrenaline faded, he felt the full weight of what they had been through. Lyra N entered the room, her steps soft but purposeful. She looked tired, her pale blue skin dulled by the strain of the past few days. But there was a light in her eyes, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle. The human looked up at her, his expression weary but grateful. "Alive," he said simply. "Thanks to you." Lyra N smiled faintly, her eyes filled with emotion. "We did it together," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You saved us. All of us." The human shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I couldn't have done it without you. You were the one who figured out the cure. You were the one who kept me going when I wanted to give up." Lyra N hesitated, then sat down beside him. "We make a good team," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "But it's not over yet. We still have a lot of work to do." The human nodded, his mind racing. The poison was gone, but the facility was in ruins. The Velani were recovering, but they had lost many of their own. And the human, he still didn't know what his future held. He was a stranger in this world, a survivor of a crisis that had brought him closer to these aliens than he ever thought possible. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Lyra N looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "We rebuild," she said simply. "We learn from what happened, and we make sure it never happens again. And we honor those we lost by moving forward." The human nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had come to this world as an outsider, a test subject. But now, he felt like he belonged. These people, these aliens, had become his family. And he wasn't ready to let them go. Over the next few days, the facility began to heal. The Velani worked together to repair the damage, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had survived. The human helped where he could, his strength slowly returning as he worked side by side with Lyra N and the others. Kael'thar, the former leader who had been consumed by the poison, was recovering as well. The cure had saved him, but the experience had changed him. He was quieter now, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a sense of humility. He approached the human one day, his expression filled with regret. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I was wrong about you. About everything. You saved us, and I almost destroyed us." The human nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all make mistakes," he said simply. "What matters is what we do next." Kael'thar hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. And I intend to make things right. Starting now." The human smiled faintly, his heart swelling with hope. Kael'thar's change of heart was a sign that they could all learn from this experience. That they could all grow. As the days turned into weeks, the human and Lyra N grew closer. They spent hours together, working on new projects and sharing stories of their lives. The human told her about Earth, about its beauty, its diversity, and its resilience. Lyra N, in turn, shared stories of her world, its harsh environment, its advanced technology, and its people's determination to survive. One evening, as they sat together in the lab, Lyra turned to the human, her expression filled with emotion. "You don't have to leave, you know," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're one of us now. And I want you to stay." The human looked at her, his heart pounding. He had been thinking about this for days, torn between his desire to stay and his longing to return to Earth. But now, as he looked into her eyes, he knew what he wanted. "I'll stay," he said simply. "For as long as you'll have me." Lyra smiled, her eyes filled with relief. "Good," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Because I don't think I could do this without you." The story of the human and the Velani spread throughout the galaxy, a tale of resilience, unity, and the power of life to overcome even the deadliest challenges. The human became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always a way forward. And as he stood beside Lyra, looking out at the stars, he knew that he had found his place in the universe. Not as a test subject, not as a prisoner, but as a hero. As a friend. As family.